Hundreds wanted to run, but only a handful of candidates was approved. As Iran's presidential hopefuls clash in a debate, many are asking why those in the running are so conservative. I'm Andrea Sankey, and today's Newsmaker is Iran's upcoming election. Whoever becomes Iran's next president will inherit an economy in crisis, along with a population that seems to be losing faith in its leadership. Almost 600 potential candidates applied to run, but only 7 were authorized by Iran's Guardian Council, and the vast majority of those are staunch conservatives. Several prominent reformists, including former Parliamentary Speaker Ali Larijani, were disqualified from running, and now the council, handpicked by the supreme leader, is accused of trying to fix the upcoming election. Now, calls to boycott the vote are pervasive, and as Natalie Pohonen reports, low turnout is a major concern for the establishment.
On June 18, Iranians will vote for their next president. There are 7 candidates, 5 hardliners and 2 reformists. And in this race to power, there is a frontrunner, the judiciary chief and ultra-conservative Ebrahim Raisi. But voters' options have been limited. Prominent reformist and moderate candidates were barred from the contest, including Ali Larijani, the former Speaker of the Parliament and a former nuclear deal negotiator. At the first presidential debate, the economic crisis was front and centre.
Different classes of people have started shouting about the inefficiencies, cruelty, poverty, discrimination and corruption.
These aren't fresh complaints from the electorate. Since 2018, Iranians have been living under severe US sanctions that were reimposed after the White House exited the nuclear deal. The coronavirus pandemic has only exacerbated what was already a fragile situation. Dissatisfaction with politics here has become so pronounced that candidates are trying to convince people to vote.
Many people think that the result of the election is already decided, but we can change the scene and the result. What I want you to do, and you are capable of doing, is to vote. Even if you want to complain about the current situation, do it through voting for me.
In Tehran, people are openly talking about the fact that they don't feel they can bring about change at the ballot box.
No one in Iran is satisfied with the conditions they are in. It has never been good, so it cannot get better than this. We live in a system that they call democracy. This is not an election, but pure theater.
I may not vote because there isn't a real opposition in the election. It's clear that Ebrahim Raisi will be elected. Therefore, this isn't an election, it's an appointment.
There have been calls on social media for a boycott of the vote. The very real prospect of a record-low turnout has concerned authorities.
اما بعضی از کسانی هستند که با بهانه‌های واهی میخوان وظیفه مشارکت در انتخابات رو کنار بگذارن و ندیده بگیرن. این عمل به خواست دشمنان ایران، دشمنان اسلام و دشمنان مردم سالاری دینی است.
While the election campaign has been unfolding, the negotiations between the Biden administration and Tehran to restore the 2015 nuclear deal have been taking place in Vienna. Outgoing President Hassan Rouhani says the main issues to restore the agreement have been resolved. The negotiations have been happening under the watch of the political establishment. That suggests it's unlikely there'll be a major shift on this all-important foreign policy front, no matter who claims victory at the polls. But securing a decisive win on June 18 and asserting political legitimacy could prove challenging when many Iranians appear disillusioned with the state of politics. Natalie Pohonen, The Newsmakers.
To talk more about the upcoming vote, I'm joined from Tehran by Mohammad Marandi. He is a political analyst and professor at Tehran University. From Prague, we have Golnaz Esfandiari. She's a senior correspondent for Radio Free Europe. And from Washington, D.C., author and the director of the Future of Iran Initiative at the Atlantic Council, Barbara Slavin. Thanks all so much for being with us. Mohammad, let me start with you because you are indeed in Tehran. If you could play the role of observer for a moment, and tell us how you think the country is actually feeling, facing the prospect in particular of record-breaking apathy. How much do Iranians actually care about this election?
Well, there is apathy because the economy has been very bad for a very long time, and also the COVID virus has taken its toll. And one of the candidates that was expected to run, Dr. Larijani, was disqualified by the Guardian Council. Right now, as we speak, there's a debate going on between the 7 candidates. 2 of them are moderates and reformists. 5 of them are what is usually called conservatives or principalists, but of different, let's say, factions or different variations of different flavors are sitting together as we speak and arguing over the past and the future.
Okay. Let me turn to Prague quickly. Golnaz, you're not in Iran, but you're Iranian yourself. I mean, how is this election leaving you feeling as a would-be voter?
I'm not going to speak on how I would be feeling. I don't think I can speak about that. But we are in contact with Iranians. We have a Persian service that's very popular. So we hear from Iranians all the time. And there's apathy. One of the main reasons for the apathy and for the frustration is the extreme vetting by the Guardians Council, which banned prominent moderate candidates and reformist candidates from running. And now you have 7 candidates, 5 of them are hardliners, and the 2 sort of moderate who were allowed to run are unknown to the Iranians. So many people in Iran see this as rather as a selection than a real election. Elections have always been unfair in Iran, but this has, has gone. The establishment has gone to extreme apparently to pave the way for the hardline head of the judiciary, Ebrahim Raisi, to become president.
Okay. Barbara, what page are you on? I mean, do you see this as that classic foregone conclusion where the president has indeed been handpicked already?
Well, it certainly looks that way. I mean, there are always surprises in Iranian elections, but between the extreme vetting of the Guardian Council and the fact that many Iranians are still not vaccinated against COVID, there's very little incentive for people to actually come out and vote. What is likely to happen is that of the 5 so-called hardliners, 4 or 3 will drop out before the vote, which means that those who do come out, the conservative base of the regime, will likely choose Ebrahim Raisi. But the turnout will be historically low, which means it's not much of a triumph for him.
Right. As you mentioned there, we know there are surprises in Iranian elections, but still, Ebrahim Raisi is the front runner. So I'd like to talk a little bit more about him in particular. But yeah, I mean, we'll also remember how much was said about, first of all, Mahmoud Ahmadinejad potentially running in this election. That didn't come to fruition. Ali Larijani was, of course, disqualified as another surprise. But now it seems people are more certain about Ebrahim Raisi taking this election. He ran and lost, back in 2017. He did, though, take more than 1/3 of the votes, if I remember correctly. He's also, of course, a close confidant of Ayatollah Hamaney. But he worries a number of human rights organizations because of his history with the judiciary. Not least, he was a deputy prosecutor of the Tehran Revolutionary Court that sent many political prisoners to their execution. Let me ask first, Golnaz, how much does that worry you if he does become the next leader of Iran?
Well, he's, as you said, Mr. Raisi is accused of serious human rights abuses. He sent thousands of political prisoners to their death, and he's the head of the judiciary, the powerful judiciary that is a tool of state repression in the Islamic Republic, the judiciary has sentenced environmentalists, intellectuals, dissidents, journalists to heavy prison sentences. So, he is seen as a dangerous figure. And in 2017, many people voted for President Rouhani to prevent Mr. Raisi from becoming president because, they thought that if he becomes president, everything is going to become worse. There's going to be more repression. If he is elected, it could mean that security apparatus will have a greater role in the country. And it would mean that all the elected institution will be controlled by the hardliner. The process started with the parliamentary election when the hardliners took control of the parliament. And now it looks like the future president of Iran could be a hardliner.
Okay. Mohammad Marandi, do you see Ebrahim Raisi as a potential tool of state repression?
Well, first of all, Ms. Esfandiari works for an organization that was created by the CIA and is funded by the American government. So obviously, I don't expect her to be unbiased.
This is wrong. Mr. Marandi,
what you said about Mr. Raisi, you work for the American government, and that's clear. So I have not said anything in particular. You work for the American government.
Okay, will you let me answer?
It's on your Twitter account where you work for. No, it's very clear.
I don't work for the American
it's my turn.
Okay, Golnaz,
I thought it was my turn.
I'd like to just hear his assessment of the candidate, and we'll come right back to you.
You work for Radio Free Europe.
Okay, let Mohammed...
You work for Radio...
No, the Radio Free Europe is not the U.S. government. We are funded by the Congress.
Let her go on. Let her have the show. Let her go on. Let her go on.
Go and study. It's all on our website.
Okay, Golnaz. We'll come back to you. I just need to get Mohammed's assessment of Ebrahim Raisi first. Go ahead.
No, she obviously, she's not unbiased. But no, what you said about Mr. Raisi comes from human rights organizations that are very closely linked to the American government. And
there are
that's
many.
Obvious nonsense. He has not sentenced any political... Excuse me, if I'm not supposed to talk, then I'll just remain quiet.
No, go ahead. I do debate where the human rights organizations are based, but go ahead.
No, which human rights organizations have said that he's executed political prisoners? What are the names of the political? If you are, first of all, those people, if you are talking about the MEK terrorist organization that fought alongside Saddam Hussein when he was waging a war against Iran and using chemical weapons, in any country, those would be traitors.
Okay,
right
fair
now,
enough.
they're working for the American government. They're based in Albania and across Europe.
Okay.
Excuse me.
I understand you don't agree with the assessment of the...
And that has nothing to do with Mr. Raisi. That is the judiciary.
Okay. Do go ahead, though. Why you do believe Mr. Raisi is getting an unfair rap from various human rights organizations? That's fine. Explain why. Do you feel he is innocent, that this has been...
No. Western human rights organizations, which have absolutely no credibility, especially when people like Assange are in prison, when the Israelis are carrying out these atrocities, an apartheid state in Western countries are completely behind the apartheid regime. They have no credibility. We all know very well that Mr. Raisi has been doing well in the polls over the past few months, whether you like him or not. So either the Iranians are a nation that like human rights violators, from your perspective or from the perspective of the guest. Barbara has once said that Iranians are anti-Semites and they're anti-Arab, which she just said a few days ago in one of her tweets, which I found offensive because I fought alongside Iraqis, the Badr Brigade in the Iraq-Iran war. I have Iraqi students, I have Iraqi PhD students who are I'm supervising as we speak, and there's no such thing in Iran. But that's just how Iran is represented. At the moment, there was one person who I expected to be a part of this presidential campaign, and that was Dr. Larijani. Mr. Ahmadinejad, no one expected him to be accepted, so that was not a surprise. It was only Dr. Larijani. And Dr. Larijani, rightly or wrongly, he has a lot of negativity right now surrounding his name because of his brother, because of it's the perceived affiliation to the administration, which I don't believe is true. But actually, he didn't have much of a chance. As we speak in the debate, Mr. Hamaney, the former head of the central bank, who was removed just a few days ago, he is hitting Raisi extremely hard. And so is Mr. Mehrarizadeh. On TV, they're insulting him left, right, and center on public Iranian television. So let's not be extreme. Let's accept that Iran as a country, under maximum pressure, under extreme sanctions, is still, and surrounded by the United States, still has a large degree of democracy and open debate. Is it ideal? Of course not. But in a world that we live in, where in the United States it's between Biden and Trump, and in Europe we see what's going on, really the Europeans and the United States don't have much to preach about.
Okay. Barbara Slavin, if you'd like to respond quickly, I'll let you go ahead. If not, I would really like to move on to issues involving the JCPOA. Go ahead.
Yeah, let's go on and talk about the JCPOA. Professor Marandi is quoting something completely out of context. But anyway, let's go ahead.
Okay, you know, we had spoken in this program actually earlier about potentially reviving the JCPOA. There was concern at the time that if the U.S. didn't do it then, you know, with Hassan Rouhani still in power, they would actually lose the chance to reinstall the deal because a hardliner in Iran might take power, and it would be much more confrontational and difficult to renegotiate restarting the JCPOA. Do you think that concern was founded?
Well, fortunately, the next president of Iran does not take over until August, which means that there is still time for the current negotiators to reach an agreement on how to return to compliance. And it's my impression, frankly, that everything has slowed down because of the Iranian elections, a desire on the part of the supreme leader not to have a breakthrough before the election, not to give poor President Rouhani even a shred of a victory in terms of getting back into the deal. But there still is time before August. And of course, we don't know the makeup of the next government, who the foreign minister would be, who the deputy foreign minister would be. It's possible that the current deputy foreign minister, Mr. Arabchi, would remain a chief negotiator. So I think this still can be done, and I think it's in the interest of both the United States and Iran to return to this agreement. For Iran, so that it will get sanctions relief, and for the United States and, frankly, the rest of the international community to roll back the advances that Iran has made in its nuclear program. Okay. So hopefully this can be done. My concern, frankly, is that with the next government coming in, we won't have much to build on. It's going to be very difficult to deal with that government, particularly if somebody like Mr. Jalili becomes the foreign minister.
Okay. Golnaz, I want to come to you in just a second, but Mohammad, first I'd like to get your thoughts on any of these candidates, particularly Ebrahim Raisi, and how they will deal with the JCPOA.
Well, first of all, what Ms. Slavin said is inaccurate. The leader has no position whatsoever with regards to when there should be a breakthrough or not. If the United States agrees to implement the deal in full today, Iran will implement the deal. But so far, the United States is unwilling to remove the sanctions. So what the United States wants is it wants to have the cake and eat it too. It wants to keep its sanctions, but it wants Iran to implement the deal in full. That's not acceptable to Iran. Iran is saying you have to implement your side of the bargain in full, and then we will implement our side of the bargain in full. But the Americans are saying, well, you know, that's not possible for us. We have Congress. Well, sorry, that's your problem. So that has nothing to do with Ayatollah Khamenei or Iran. So let's not blame Iran for the United States. Let's not blame Iran for what the United States is doing. It's very clear that the ball is in the American court.
Go ahead, Barbara, quickly.
Yes, it's very clear that this has to be sequenced and that Iran has to present concrete steps to roll back its program. And that's what the United States is waiting for. The US has already put on the table the sanctions that will be removed.
Okay. If we can, I'd like to bring.
No, the United States has to go back to when the nuclear deal was signed. The United States has to go back to then. The nuclear deal is very clear what the United. Don't pretend, Barbara. Don't pretend that it's any different from that. The United States wants to keep the sanctions that it added after the deal was signed. If that's the case, then the Iranians can do whatever it wants and say that that belongs to the period after the deal.
Interesting.
The
It
deal,
seems the
when
debate
it was
remains
signed,
the same.
the United States has to go back to then.
The debate remains the same, actually, no matter who takes power in the upcoming election. There's still that back and forth between the U.S. and Iran and who has to move first.
Absolutely.
But we only have a few minutes left. So I wanted to let me get Golnaz back in the flow here, and let's talk about where you think the next candidate will move as far as new allies or old allies are concerned. Many are talking about leaning further toward China, perhaps Russia. Barbara, I know you mentioned regionally. Iran will mend some fences. But Golnaz, where do you see the strongest ties forming with a new president?
Can I just make a quick point about the JCPOA? I think the establishment as a whole has decided to engage in nuclear talks, in direct nuclear talks with the US in order to revive the nuclear deal. So it's not the presidents who make such a decision. It comes from the establishment as a whole. And these kind of policies are usually decided in the National Supreme Council. So I don't think a change of president would change anything. Iran is under crushing US sanctions, and Iran needs sanctions relief. And let's not forget that Iran remained committed to the nuclear deal for a year after former President Trump left the deal, and then gradually started reducing its commitment under the deal.
Okay. Golnaz, quickly, though, if you'd like to comment on where you see the regional allies going as well as the international.
Well, as you mentioned, it seems that there's this view towards the East that has been promoted by the conservatives. They just signed a 25-year agreement with China, so it looks like this could be the way the country would be moving if a hardliner is elected.
Okay, and Barbara, you said regionally Iran will be mending fences. What did you mean by that?
Well, I think it's also in Iran's interest and in the interest of its neighbors to reduce some of the tensions that we've seen, particularly under the Trump administration. And Iran and Saudi Arabia are already engaged in talks, for example, in Iraq, which is a good sign. Iran needs to focus on its economy, and that will be priority number one, I think, for whoever wins the election.
Okay, Mohammad Marandi, as far as those who see Iran turning further east post this election, do you feel that's a fair assessment?
I really have great difficulty hearing, so if I'm not from the very beginning, that's been the problem. But let me point out two very quick things. One is that the elections will be important, but as I think Ms. Esfandiari said, the decision on the nuclear discussions will be with the Supreme National Security Council, where the president has a role, but the Iranians have said from the very beginning that the only way that we will implement the deal is if the Americans fully implement the deal. And if the Europeans and the Americans don't want Iran to tilt towards the east or the global south, then the best way forward is for them to implement the nuclear deal. If they don't like Iran's peaceful nuclear program, then the way forward is for them to implement the nuclear deal. But to blame Iran for their sanctions that are in violation of the deal and their insistence on keeping those sanctions is not going to work.
Okay, very quickly though, apart from the JCPOA, where do you see, if at all, Iran trying to build stronger ties, if it cannot in particular mend those fences with Western counterparts?
I think Iran will be building on its relationships with regional countries. I think the Saudis, after this genocidal war in Yemen, where it is lost, it needs to have a better relationship with Iran. I think Iran's relationship with Russia, China, and other neighboring countries, and in general the global South, especially with the changes that we are beginning to see in Latin America, I think there's a lot of room for maneuver with Iran, and especially because of the disastrous defeat of the Israelis in the eyes of Iranians in Gaza. I think that strengthens Iran's hand as well. So Iran will be looking for friends and allies. So if the Americans and the Europeans want to keep the door shut, then the Iranians will use the doors that are open. That's the only realistic way forward. Again, as I said, Europeans and Americans have a tradition of wanting to have their cake and eat it too. It's not going to work with Iran.
Okay, Mohammad Marandi, I will have to let you have the last word because very unfortunately we're out of time for this edition of the Newsmakers. I'd like to thank all three of my panelists really so much for joining us, and to our viewers, of course, for being with us as well. We'll see you next time.